Why should I train the hip specifically? One of the biggest mistakes that people make is saying, hey, well, I do squats or I do, deadlifts. Deadlifts are a hip dominant exercise. Well, yes, those exercises require you to have a hip, but those exercises are not necessarily improving the function of the hip. Remember, the function of the hip is to provide you with degrees of freedom and rotation. And those exercises are just exercises that focus in on a specific aspect and element of tissue in the hip. So we're limiting our movement to those specific movements like a hinge or like a squat, which requires hip flexion. But that's not necessarily improving the rotational capacities of your joint or improving the joint space required to do all of those movements. In this type of training, we're focused in specifically on building a better joint that can give you access to all of those things when you want them. Think of it like this. If I have a city, your hip joint is that city, but that city has boulevards, regular streets, highways. If I'm doing a deadlift, maybe that improves the highway. If I'm doing a squat, maybe that improves one of the streets. But if I'm talking about on a deeper level, what is the fundamental thing that all of those have in common? It's the asphalt or the concrete or the materials that are used to build those roads so that you can do all of the things on them. This is what mobility training is. It's building that infrastructure. It's fixing those potholes. It's smoothing out the roads so we can be more efficient and we can be more effective at what we do overall with our joints themselves. So what are your hips designed to do? Well, your hips are designed to give you a great degree of freedom. The hips are a ball and socket joint, which means that the head of this big, large bone below your hip fits right into the pelvis. So that has to be able to move around through that joint freely. Whether you're doing hip flexion, bringing the leg up, that's going to also require rotation of that bone inside of the joint. Or you're bringing your leg out to the side, that's still going to require rotation of that bone inside of the joint. So regardless of what you're doing, rotation is fundamental and they're designed to rotate well. If they don't rotate well, then access to those other movements is going to be limited. If it isn't clear to you why hip mobility is important, then you probably wouldn't be on this page to begin with. The biggest pain point that we often get approached with is the hips. From our personal training clients to people online, we get questions about tight hips or hip issues. And not to mention the fact that the hips are related to all the other joints in the body because they give you a big degree of freedom. So whether it's knee issues or lower back issues, sometimes the hips have a part to play in the issues that you might be experiencing there. So why is hip mobility important? Well, it's important because you need to be able to move and access those degrees of freedom, whether you walk, run, squat, jump, golf, doesn't matter. Having more degrees of freedom and the ability to use those degrees of freedom is going to benefit you exponentially and benefit your longevity for the rest of your life. All right, so the very first thing I like to prescribe for my clients is hip cars. I think hip cars is a great entry point for helping people understand what their hips are capable of. And so it just takes your hip through its fullest range of available motion, and that gives your hips and all your tissues surrounding the hip joint an ability to be nourished, get the tissue and the nervous system aware of the space available, and just helps you understand the overall fundamental movements of your hips. Check out this video as I show you how to do hip cars, and you can start integrating that into your training. All right, the very first thing we have to understand is that running is a very linear sport. So in that sport, the hips are required to go into flexion and some degree of extension over and over and over again. And so our hips become more efficient and more accommodated at doing that motion. The hip, although it can do that motion, that's not its fundamental objective. The hip's objective is a lot of different variable movements. And the hip joint is a ball and socket, so the ball and socket needs to rotate in that joint, and it needs to rotate well in order for you to have a healthy joint. I always believe that the worst posture is the posture you spend the most time in. And so it's not about one good posture or one bad posture, it's about what posture do I spend the vast majority of my time in, and how do I supplement that with other things in order to help improve my overall life. The very first thing I say is do hip cars. Why?
Because hip cars provide the fundamental movement of the joint, which is rotation. It takes it through all the variable movements of the hip joint. So it gives the joint nourishment and it allows the bone to move freely or within the ranges that you have available. A hip car looks like this. We start out standing nice and tall. I'm gonna bring the leg across into adduction. So I'm trying to squeeze here. I'm gonna scoop into external rotation. I'm gonna take as much external rotation as I can as I move through flexion. Once I run out of room in external rotation and flexion, I'm gonna begin to move out of external rotation and scoop in a little bit more flexion. I'm gonna move out into abduction, so moving and opening the gate. Once I can no longer open the gate any further than that, I'm gonna change positions here. I'm going to begin to internally rotate. So I'm trying to find as much internal rotation as I have there without dumping through the hips here. So I'm internally rotating, moving my hip through its fullest range of motion. I'm sneaking out some extension here. I gotta create a little bit more space here because of the bar. And I'm sneaking out a little bit of extension through there as I bring the leg back to join the other knee. Once I join the other knee, I'm gonna move back into extension, which we have very little of, so squeezing this stuff here. And then I'm going to begin to abduct, so bringing the leg away from the midline. And then I'm going to externally rotate. So I'm externally rotating back up into that flexion. Okay, now that I'm in that flexion, I'm going to bring my leg back across, sneak out some more external rotation, adduct, so I'm squeezing that together, and back down. So I teach my clients to move through that on a regular basis, daily, pre-run, post-run, all of that, because we want to remind the body of its fundamental movements. We want to remind the nervous system what the fundamental movement of your joint is. It's not to cycle, it's not to run, it's not to do all of those linear things that we like doing. It's to move freely through rotation. Add that to your daily routine, add that to your pre and post training, and just sprinkle it in throughout the rest of your life and watch how things change. So hip cars, as I said, is a very good entry point for training your hip, getting started with nourishing the hip and beginning your hip mobility journey. The very next thing that I'm going to have you do is check out hip extension. Now, as we run, typically we don't move through our fullest range of hip motion in flexion and extension. And this just gives us an opportunity to work in that end range of hip extension that we may not be accessing throughout the volume of running that we do. And so as we begin to do more and more running, we begin to accommodate and build in the mobility and the strength within a small window of range. I want to take you out of that range and get you into a deeper stretch and get your hips more awareness of that space that you should have available, not only as a runner, but just as someone who wants to move through life more efficiently and effectively. Check out this video as I show you how to do hip extension and get a little bit more mobility out of the end range of that movement. Pails and rails for hip extension. So you're gonna line up here in this split kneeling position. And what I'm looking for is a stretch of this tissue here in the front. Now you might have already found it from just being here, but if not, you can play around with this position of the pelvis. I like to scoop the pelvis up, so imagine the belt buckle going up towards my face to create that stretch here. And then I'll lean slightly forward to get a little bit deeper into it. I'll hold that stretch for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, I'm gonna drive the knee down and forward, trying to activate this stuff here as if I was trying to kick my leg through. And then my rails contraction is going to be pulling back, squeezing this stuff back here to try and drag this bone backwards. Okay, so Pails contraction is driving down and forward to contract this tissue here, ramping up slowly over time to your maximal effort. And then your rails contraction is pulling back, squeezing this stuff here. So we've created a little bit more range in hip extension. We've been able to access that tissue and we showed you how to create that. But what about hip flexion? As we run, oftentimes we may not move into our full range of hip flexion. Unless we're a sprinter, we're not actually lifting our knee up and getting that full hip range of motion. And so we're accommodating to running through a very small window, at least most of us are, running through a very small window of motion for our knee joint. So we may not be moving through a full high stride of that knee as we're running unless we're doing sprints. So our runs may have our hip going through this constant motion all over and over again. And since we're not accessing that full range, we begin to accommodate, or our body begins to prefer that range of motion. So I want to take you out of that range of motion, have you move into a deeper range of hip flexion, and help you understand that we can access a broader range of that motion, and we can train that tissue as well. Check out this video as I show you how to move into end range hip flexion and how to train that isometrically in this. Pails and rails for bent knee hip flexion. So we're going to start here in bent knee hip flexion. What I'm going to do is look for a stretch of this tissue back here behind me. So I'm going to take my hips and I'm going to shift so that I'm going to shift them this direction, pelvis and belt buckle facing down towards the ground, in order to find a stretch of this tissue. Once I've found that stretch of that tissue, I'm going to hang out for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, I'm going to begin to drive down into the box, making the foot heavy by using this stuff here. Once I ramp up to my maximal effort, I'm going to reverse that for my rails contraction, which is pulling this bone closer to my abdomen for that rails contraction. So pails contraction is driving down, ramping up this stuff. Rails contraction is pulling closer to me, trying to make the foot light on the box. So that was hip flexion, looking at your end range of hip flexion and learning how to contract and create force in that space. That's a great way to help your body understand that this range should be available to you as well. And not forget to train that space as we produce a lot of volume in those other ranges, but we don't typically place a lot of emphasis on creating volume in that later range or that later window of range of motion. Hopefully this video shed some insight and help you understand a little bit more about what your hips are capable of and what you can be doing to help improve your overall broad range of motion. And if this video helped you, please be sure to share it with a friend who runs. Be sure to smash the subscribe button so you never miss a post from me again. So oftentimes golfers will come in and they're complaining about stiffness of the low back or issues they're having with their low back. And after a full assessment, I'll give them some feedback on what's going on with their body specifically to help guide them through and help them understand some of the things that they might want to improve on, and then we give them a plan. In general though, when we're looking at what's going on with a golfer, we have to have a considerable amount of thoracic rotation as we move into the backswing, and then we have to have control of that rotation as we move through our full range of motion and finish through our swing. So if you don't have adequate rotation in the stuff above the lumbar spine, sometimes those demands can get transferred downward into the lumbar spine. So now you're asking the lumbar spine to do some rotation that it might not be comfortable doing, and the lumbar spine is not built for rotation. It's built for other movements, flexion and extension mainly, but not rotation. So if we're placing demands for rotation on the lumbar spine there, that could be producing a little bit of an issue. The other thing that might be contributing is lack of rotation at the hip. So if you notice when you go into the backswing, it requires a considerable amount of internal rotation of your back hip. And as you move through and you finish your swing, it requires a considerable amount of internal rotation on this hip. So a certain amount of external rotation here, internal rotation here, and then as you come through, external rotation here, internal rotation here. If your hips don't rotate well, then that lack of rotation can also be a contributing factor. So better hip, better thoracic spine rotation should help you a little bit. Every little bit counts. So lumbar spine should be able to flex and extend well, rotation above, rotation below well, and that's at least a starting point for where we can start to look at addressing our body. Oftentimes it is lack of ability to move that we need to address. And if we can improve range of motion, then we can strengthen that range of motion. If we don't have the range of motion, then we can't even strengthen that space. So there's 3 exercises that I like to use with all of my golf clients with regards to rotation of the spine. But the very first thing I do is I address flexion and extension of the spines. Flexion and extension provides you the basis for rotation of the thoracic spine. So I often start my clients out with cat-cow. Simple, effective, flexion, and extension. Better flexion provides us better ability to rotate. So all of my golf clients receive cat-cow, but then we take it one step further and we go into spinal segmentation. You can check out spinal segmentation in one of my other videos. The next thing we do with the spine is thoracolumbar cars. Thoracolumbar cars are a great way to get through all of the various motions of the spine. This is just bringing awareness to the tissues. So this isn't the point in which we're adding more range of motion or we're trying to expand range and capacity. We're just trying to bring more awareness to the tissue to start out with. So we bring the hands across the chest, we move into flexion, we rotate through that thoracic spine, we laterally flex, we extend, rotate all the way over to the opposite side, laterally flex, and rotate back through. You can do that in both different directions. Check out some of the videos that I have in my spine section on my channel to find out how to do that more effectively. Next, we'll want to address the hips. And with the hips, we'll start with wanting to bring awareness to the joint itself. So first thing we'll do is hip cars. We'll start by bringing the leg across the body, going into external rotation and flexion, abduction, rotating into internal rotation and extending, bringing the knee to join the other knee, and then we'll extend back, externally rotate, sweep back through, adduct the way we came. Cars are an easy way to bring awareness to the joint to begin with, and once we've brought awareness to the joint to begin with, we can begin to start thinking about internal and external rotation of the joint. One of the ways I like to start addressing internal rotation on my golf clients is to get them as close to the position that they would be in for golf. So I like to get them in a split kneeling position because that way the femur is in a position similar to where they would be for standing. But I'm trying to get internal rotation of this bone here. So I'll take my instep of my foot and I'll place it against a box or a wall or whatever I'm in front of, and I'll move down into internal rotation of this hip. And now I'm into internal rotation of this hip. I can stretch this tissue here, and I'm going to hold that stretch for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, I'm going to do a Pales contraction, which is an isometric, driving the instep of my foot into the block, box, wall, whatever I'm up against. I'm going to ramp that up to my maximum effort, hold that for about 10 to 15 seconds, and then I'm going to reverse that, trying to take the foot away from the edge of the box, so take the instep away from the edge of the box, squeezing this outer stuff on my hip, my internal rotator stuff, and I'm going to squeeze that as hard as I can maximally, and then I'm going to relax. Okay, that's one of the ways where I help my clients address a lack of internal rotation and help them try to expand that rotation. So we 2-minute hold, we do our Pales contraction and then our rails contraction. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can check out some of the videos that I have on my page in the hip mobility section, which breaks down a lot of different ways in which you can do Pales and rails for hip internal rotation. In some cases, my client may be lacking external rotation, and so one of the setups I like to use for external rotation is standing on a slanted bench. Other than that, you can be side-lying. There's some other positions and setups that I have available here on my page, on my channel. You can check the hip training section or the hip mobility section, and I have tons of videos there which can inform you on different ways we can set up for this. But I like to use a slanted bench here because it gives me an opportunity to find a stretch in the back of this hip here. And now at this point here, I cannot lift off. So this is my end point of external rotation, but I'm going to go about 10 to 15 degrees further. So in order to do that, I'm going to take my hip here and I'm going to just shift it just a little bit. And I'm going to tilt my body just a little bit away. Okay, so I'm now increased the rotation of my hip joint. More external rotation here, and I'm going to hold that stretch for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, I'm going to begin to drive this leg, the outer part of this foot, into the bench. So I'm trying to do this motion here.
as I drive and try to do that motion there, I'm driving all that outer tissue of my hip, ramping up to my greatest effort. And when I do, I'm gonna hold that for 10 to 15 seconds. And then I'm gonna do my rails contraction, which is trying to lift this leg off. And obviously it's not gonna lift off because I'm beyond my end range of motion, but I'm contracting all this tissue here on the inner side of the joint. Maximal effort, hold for 10 seconds, and relax. Those are just a few things that I do with my golf clients specifically that help them expand capacity for movement. Once they've expanded capacity for movement, all the things that they do come easier. So we can expand capacity, strengthen those ranges, and then all the activities they want to do, they just fill right into that space. Of course, we address their lumbar spine as well, and you can check out some of my videos on training the low back in the spinal mobility section of my channel. All right, let's get it. So when you're doing yoga, for example, you're looking at doing things like pigeon pose, and oftentimes pigeon pose places a large demand on external rotation of the hip. A lot of people don't have the necessary external rotation of the hip to be in that position. So oftentimes what happens with a lot of the yogis that I end up training and seeing is that they're looking for an understanding as to why their hips or their low back might be giving them a little bit problems. And oftentimes, control of the hip is lacking. So oftentimes, I'll have a yogi who has a lot of range of motion, so I can get them into a lot of passive range, which is a lot of what's happening when you're in the pigeon pose. But then when I ask them to do active range of motion, and I assess their active range, what happens is they end up short. That tells me a little bit about what's going on with their hip. So they have all of this passive range, but there's this window where they don't have control of it. Now, it's important for us to understand that having control of your range of motion is an important aspect. We don't want to end up in a position that we're out of control. So what we want to do is we want to get that person to learn to control that. So what I might do is I might bring Yana to this position here. This is her passive range of motion. This is her potential for strength and movement. All that gap right here is room that she doesn't have the ability to connect her brain to her stuff that's moving her into this position. So I might say, hey, Yana, can you hold this position here? If she can hold that, great. But sometimes what happens is immediately when I let go, it's like a rubber band. Boom, goes right back to that position that it's comfortable with. If that's the case, what I might do is I might do some positional isometrics here just so I can get her to understand how to contract the tissues that are here. So I might hold here and I might have her rotate this direction and rotate towards me, giving me a little bit of force that way so she can learn how to contract that stuff on the back side of the hip. And then I might have her rotate the opposite way or try to connect with this stuff on the front side of the hip to try and rotate further into this position here. I might give her a little bit of resistance here, so I might give her a little pull so she can feel what it's like to resist that. And I might give her a little push here on the backside so she knows how to push up against something going that direction. Isometrics are a great tool that you can use to help people fill in the gaps of strength that they might be missing. If you found this video useful, smash the subscribe button so you never miss a post from me. Be sure to like this post and share it with a yogi that you know that might need a little bit more control of their range of motion. All right, let's get started. So the very first thing that I like to do is a straight leg isometric, so a pails and rails contraction to try and get a little bit more of my external rotation in straight leg hip flexion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my leg up onto a box or a bench. I'm going to take my leg into external rotation. So I'm in external rotation here. I've got a slight knee bend. From here, if I had a staff, I'd be able to lift off. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to try and get myself deeper into that stretch and stretch that hip stuff back here in the back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my belt buckle and I'm going to imagine pointing it towards the floor. From here, that's going to put all that tissue back there on stretch. I'm going to hold that for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, I'm going to begin to drive my heel into the floor, ramping up to maximum effort, trying to find that line of tissue from external rotation that I would use to engage and drive backwards. So I should feel that all back here. I'm going to ramp to my maximum effort.
And once I ramp to my maximum effort, I'm going to reverse that, and I'm going to try and contract the stuff on the front side of the hip that would bring my thigh towards my chest. It's not going to happen because I should be at in range, but I'm getting that contraction, that in range contraction of the front side of the hip. After I've done that isometric contraction, I can think about ways in which I want to train that tissue. And so to train that tissue, now we're going to look at doing something that goes through actual motion. So I'm going to start with a staggered stance. So this is how I would start some of my clients, in a staggered stance, so that it gives them the confidence to be able to be on 2 feet. So I'm going to bring the leg back just a bit so I have space for the kettlebell. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move into external rotation of the hip here. So I'm going to move my hips move my pelvis relative to my femur here. And so what that's going to do is that's going to put my hip in external rotation. From there, I'm going to try not to kick out to the side. What I'm going to try to do is keep those hips aligned as much as possible as I rotate here. And so, got the kettlebell. I'm going to be in that position here. I can feel that tissue in the back here, and I'm going to drive this leg in the ground. My back foot is staggered, so I'm going to keep a lot of the weight off of that. Sniff some air into the abdomen. Come up, rotate back, stick the hips back behind me, kind of like I'm doing a deadlift or the hinge portion of a kettlebell swing. So I'm working that external rotation of the hip as I move my pelvis over the top of the femur. What I would do next is I would take the staggered foot and I would lift it and do unloaded position. So here I'm balancing, stabilizing, coming over to one side and back up. So that is external rotation because I'm taking the pelvis and moving it relative to the femur as I move into external rotation, touch, and back up. Or I can even do a skater sort of movement as well if I want to get deeper into that position. Then I would take a kettlebell and do that same thing. So I would come into this position, I would stagger, balance, load, and back up, stagger, balance, load, and back up. If you found this video useful, please share it with a friend and be sure to subscribe to my channel so you never miss a post from me again. So the very first thing I'm going to do is a passive range hold. So I'm going to take Yana into her passive range, and of course I'm going to use a towel here because we don't know where Yana's shoes have been. So we're going to take her into her passive range. So she's relaxed here. I'm going to take her and move her into her passive range of motion. Once we're here, I'm going to tell her to sniff some air into the midsection, drive her hands down into the box, and I want her to hold this position here. She can even drive this heel up against the box in order to maintain that position there. We're going to let go. Now this isn't as challenging as if she were sidelined because she would have gravity trying to pull downward. So what I can do is I can give a little bit of force here and I can make her work a little bit harder until she collapses and kind of fails through the range of motion, becoming an eccentric. One of the other things that I like to do is add ankle weights. You can do that. That's another way to add external load. What we can also do to kind of train the range is we can do kind of lift-offs from here. So we can lift off one leg at a time, for example. So she would drive this heel into the box, and I would have her lift this leg off for me. That's pretty easy for her, and then back down. But what I can also do is I can change her start position. So I can move her into a range here to start from, and I can ask her to lift off from my hand here. And now she's lifted off from my hand there, and she parachutes back to my hand. I can take her a little bit further, relax here, she's totally relaxed in my hand, and I can ask her to contract and try and lift off from my hand from this point here. Now that's going to be a lot harder, and it's going to require a little bit more neural drive to create that contraction the closer she is to end range. The very last thing we can do to challenge people in their internal rotation is work 2 hips at the same time. Now, I like to work unilaterally because I like to have all that neural drive driven into one specific set of tissue. But if you're short on time, you might want to do both hips at the same time,
And that also makes it so that the hip girdle cannot really shift. So if you take both knees at the same, or you take both femurs at the same time, rotate them into internal rotation, now the hips have nowhere to shift and go. They both have to rotate at the same time, so the pelvic girdle is not really shifting one way or the other.